Hey, Mark, good to see you. All right, everybody, here we are, class 4. So we are doing our little intro into ethics. We know that we're going to be focusing on this subjectivity, objectivity, what's the quality of moral statements thing that Edwards wants to focus on. To recap, we got to see an essay from a deontologist. We got to see an essay from someone who thinks it's duty-based and you should use rationality to figure out what your duty is. And he argued, well, we won't rehash too much of it right now, but he had quite a lot to say. And then we just finished an argument from Russell, which that was a really interesting class, actually, I think, on his view that ethical statements, moral judgments are subjective at their base. And that's going to lead us to today's discussion and reading, the objectivity of moral judgments. This is by A.C. Ewing. So obviously he's gonna provide the other side of this Bertrand Russell thing. All right, let's take a look. One class of answer to the question how good is to be defined is given by the subjectivists. But before we consider this type of answer, we must try to make clear to ourselves what could be meant by the objectivity of ethical judgments or of value judgments in general. It obviously does not mean that they ascribe value properties to physical objects. These clearly do not possess ethical qualities. It might indeed be held that they possessed the property of beauty, and therefore the property of intrinsic goodness, quite independently of being perceived. This view does not seem to me obviously false, but it is plain that most philosophers who have asserted the objectivity of value judgments do not wish to commit themselves to it, still less to maintain that all value judgments were objective in precisely the same sense that in which judgments about physical objects are. We can therefore rule out at once the sense of objective as referring to what exists independently of being experienced. What then does objective mean when used in reference to ethics? It may mean claiming to be true. Obviously, in this sense, judgments about psychological events and dispositions are objective, though they do not refer to what exists independently of experience. And in this sense, ethical judgments may be objective. To say they are is indeed to say no more than to say that they are judgments and not merely something else which we have confused with judgments. But even this much is denied by some who maintain that so-called ethical judgments are only exclamations, commands, or wishes. However, a person who admitted the occurrence of ethical judgments but denied that they were ever in fact true, or that we could ever have any justification for believing them to be true, would not usually be described as holding an objective view of ethics. So objective here may be taken as implying that ethical judgments in particular and value judgments in general are sometimes true and can be sometimes known, or at least justifiably believed to be true. An objective view involves the rejection of skepticism in ethics. So we remember from our intro, we had all these different camps that we said are going to be joining into this battlefield. And he's saying, look, I get that the objective subjective distinction sort of means this, but also obviously people who are arguing for the objectivity of moral values, most of the time they're actually saying it's something that could be known and it could be true. So let's not worry about the skeptics, but let's also not worry about the people who affirm that they're objective, but that they're all wrong, which we noticed there was a group of people who had that theory. He's saying, look, let's not get too complicated about who's on the battlefield. Maybe some of these players don't count for what we're going to consider here today. Let's consider, are they objective versus subjective? Can they be known? All right. But this would not by itself be sufficient to satisfy the holders of the view that ethical judgments are objective. Suppose A is good. Simply meant I have a certain feeling about A. It would then be a judgment and could perfectly well be true and be known to be true. Yet anybody who maintains such a position would be said to be holding a subjective and not an objective view of ethics. Okay, this is that other distinction, and it's pretty clear, but we'll just repeat it. He's saying, look, if all you mean by murder is wrong is I don't like murder, you are making a claim that could be true. It's a claim not about murder, it's a claim about your feelings about murder, right? And so that wouldn't be enough to be in the category of the people who like to argue that morality is objective. Does anybody know how to silence their phone? There, I think that'll work. Okay. So he says, look, we're not going to include that. Anybody in the camp that I want to argue for, he's going to try to argue that moral or ethical judgments are objective. He's saying, let me show you where I'm standing on this battlefield. I'm not with these guys who say, yeah, it's objective, it's just always wrong. That's a small group, maybe, perhaps. I'm not standing over here with these guys that are saying it's just emotion. It is actually a judgment. I'm also saying, look, the skeptics might think it could be objective, but they don't think we could ever know it. It's like, no, those guys, I'm not over there either. I'm actually going to argue that there are things that you can say about things being wrong or right, good or bad, evil, whatever. You can make moral judgments, ethical statements that can be true and that you can be justified in saying are true, and that are true not about your feelings, but are true about something out there in the world. That's good and admirable. This is something that young writers and you know, people just starting to engage in writing in academia often have the opposite instinct of this. What he's doing here is very admirable. He's saying, look, I'm coming into the fight. I'm going to argue something. Let me be very clear about what I'm arguing, right? Because if you want to attack it, I want you to know exactly where I'm standing. Bring it on. Let's have the fight. That's the whole point of this. A lot of times people try to be ambiguous. They're like, well, maybe I'm over here, maybe I'm over there. And it's like, okay, well, you're trying to protect yourself, but you're not trying to defend the ground. And how, that's not much of a contribution. So he's doing a good job. He's saying, look, I'm not there. I'm not there. I'm not there. I'm not over here. My main enemy are these subjectivists. I'm going to make an argument really straightforwardly. I'm going to try to punch the subjectivists right in the nose from this objectivist hill over here. Okay. They are not merely judgments about his feelings, or for that matter, his thoughts. Even if partly based on feeling, they are not about the feeling itself, but about something to which the feeling points, and something which cannot adequately be described in terms merely of the man's own psychology. All right. That's what he thinks the standard is for a moral judgment to be objective. And then I think what he's going to do is try to argue that that's what they actually are. Okay. The view that ethical judgments are objective, therefore, excludes the following views. A, that they are not really judgments at all. B, that they are all false, or that we are never justified in thinking them true. And C, that they are merely judgments about one's own psychological state or dispositions. Any of these three alternative views, he's going to say, can be called subjective. We looked in our intro that there's other categories we can put them in, but basically he's saying they're not me, right? They're the enemy in a sense of my objectivity of this, or maybe he's not going to argue for it, but I think he is. And so the idea is like, if someone wants to say moral judgments are objective, they are the enemy of all those other camps. And then he's going to call all those other camps subjective, which, we could agree or disagree. For the purpose of this essay, it's a perfectly fine way of defining things, and we understand what he means. And that's another thing we do that you can think of is like, look how admirable it is. He's saying, look, I'm not going to argue that this is the right way to define things. I'm going to define it so that you know how I'm using the word, so that there's no confusion between us. And that's perfectly fine. We should take his definition, not forever, but when we're reading him, to be fair and to do a charitable job of reading what he's saying, he's making it as easy as possible for us to understand exactly what he thinks, so that we can agree or disagree. And that's the way to make an argument. Okay. In academia. Okay. The difficulties of subjectivism. So all right. So now we know where he's standing, cleared the way. Let's get into it. So first he's going to start firing some shots at these subjectivists, which he includes, 5 different ways of not being an objectivist, we should say. All right. The simplest form of the subjectivist view is that according to which ethical judgments, though genuine judgments, assert only that the person who makes the judgment has or tends to have certain feelings. Welcome, Alana. All right, so he's going to shoot at them first. The idea we mentioned this before, that some people say from the meta ethical conversation that we're having here, that moral judgments like murder is wrong or euthanasia should be legal, that really those statements mean nothing more than I don't like murder and I hope you don't like it either, or boo murder or something like that. It's not actually about something, it's more of an emotive thing. So he's going to fire at those people first, and he's going to say, this is good or right on such a view because I have or tend to have an emotion of approval on considering this, unquote. So that's the way you would translate them if you're one of those emotivist types. A number of incredibly paradoxical consequences would follow from the adoption of such a view, he says. Firstly, the judgments could not be false unless the person judging had made a mistake about his own psychology. Secondly, two different people would never mean the same thing when they made such a judgment, since each would mean this is approved by me. Right? So we'll repeat this in a second, but he's got a lot of attacks for this view. So let's continue. Indeed, the same person would never mean the same by it on two different occasions, because each time he would mean, I right now feel or tend to feel approval for X. Okay. Thirdly, if I judge something to be good and you judge it to be bad, our judgments would never be logically incompatible with each other. It is not a sufficient reply to point out that they can still be incompatible with each other in some different sense. For example, in the sense that they express attitudes which are in conflict with each other or lead to incompatible policies. All right, before we go on with that, all right, he said, this is where I'm standing. Hey, everybody, I'm going to defend this objectivist mountain on this battlefield here. Now that he's done that, he goes bang, bang, bang. He starts immediately shooting at one of the groups of people he's identified as denying his ground, that moral statements are about something and that they can be true and that we might know them sometimes. And the first ones he's attacking are the emotivists. He's saying, okay, well, first of all, murder is wrong really means nothing more than boo murder. I don't like murder. Okay. Well, that has some consequences. The first consequence is those are always true unless a person is confused about how they feel. So moral statements are always true unless you're confused. You're a very confused person when it comes to how you feel about things. That's weird. The second thing is that no two people would ever mean the same thing. So murder is wrong actually means something different every single time a person utters it, because you saying that you don't like murder is a totally different subject than me saying I don't like murder. We're not talking about murder. You're just saying, hey, how you feel. And now I'm saying how I feel. It's like, okay, that's a weird thing to do to a statement, which pretty much seems like it's about a subject other than just the person. And then he goes further to say, the next time I say I don't like murder, what I mean is right now I feel bad about murder. And earlier I did too when I said it. So the statements actually mean something different every time they're uttered. That's a weird consequence. And then thirdly, he says, we can't even disagree. We're always right unless we're confused about ourselves. But also, if I say murder is wrong, and that really just means I don't like murder, and Savad says murder is great, and I'm not trying to put a negative moral judgment on you, but if we disagree about a moral claim, uh, we're not disagreeing about anything. There's nothing to disagree about. You say I don't like it, and I say I do like it. It would be like me saying I like Rocky Road ice cream, and you saying you don't like Rocky Road ice cream. There's no disagreement there. He says unless we twist disagreement to mean we have attitudinal different inclinations, but that's not really a disagreement. Not in the sense that you could argue about things. Of course, the emotivists understand. Well, let's see where this goes. So, for we do not see merely the A's judgment, person A, his judgment, this is good, and B's judgment, this is bad. in the corresponding sense of the word, lead to or express incompatible policies like A's judgment, I desire to further X, and B's judgment, I desire to oppose X. We see that the two judgments logically contradict each other so that it is logically impossible that they could both be true. No doubt, since good and bad can each be used in different senses. This is bad may mean always contradict, or I'm sorry, may not always contradict this is good, because, for example, good may mean instrumentally good and bad may mean intrinsically bad. But at any rate, they sometimes do so. And on the view under discussion, they could, when asserted by different people, never do so. Fourthly, no argument or rational discussion, nor indeed any citation of empirical facts, could be in any degree relevant to supporting or casting doubt on any ethical judgment unless it could be directed to showing that the person who makes the judgment has made a mistake about his own feelings or tendencies to have feelings. It is true that argument or fresh knowledge about the circumstances and likely consequences of an act might lead me to have different feelings about it and so judge it right while I had judged it wrong before, or vice versa. But it would not in any way indicate that my previous judgment was false. The judgments would be different, but since they referred only to my feelings at different times, they would not contradict each other any more than I was ill on January 1st contradicts I am feeling better now. Yet, it is clear that arguments can really cast doubt on propositions in ethics. All right, before we go on, I want to look at the way he's arguing so far, right? He might use other methods in future. But one of the fun things about philosophy is not only do we argue about all the topics and everything is arguable, and it turns out there's like, dozens of camps in each argument that you might not even imagine somebody could think, but we also argue about the appropriate ways to argue. We argue about, what should matter to us, right? So there's ways of thinking that certain philosophers are really adherents of, and if you bring a different kind of an argument to them, they just sort of look like, why should that matter to me to change my mind? That's the wrong way to think, and so on. So everything is up for debate in philosophy is maybe a good rule or a good way of putting it. Um, Likewise, so far it seems to me that he's employing a very common philosophical way of reasoning, that happens a lot in these sorts of discussions where we're doing meta conversation where we're saying, well, okay, if biology is trying to figure out facts about life and speak honestly or truthfully or accurately, and answer questions about living organisms and such, then the philosophy of biology is talking about that conversation, saying, well, when the biologists say this, what does that really mean? Or in what context, or in what way do they have to limit what they can consider in order for those statements to accurately be true, or blah, blah, blah. Well, likewise, when we're doing meta ethics, we're talking about the ethical discussion, and sometimes within the ethical discussion, but often within meta ethics, people make the following type of argument. They say, look around you at the kinds of conversations we're having when we use these words. That seems to be some evidence that the words don't mean this type of thing, they must mean that type of thing, right? So it's not exactly clear what the arguments are yet here if we don't spell that out, right? Because what he's saying are the logical consequences of an emotivist position, right? He's saying, nah, when you say murder is bad, all you could possibly mean is boo, I don't like it. And then, as we've seen, some of them can say, so let's go out and have those discussions and try to get people to agree or disagree in their attitudes. But there's nothing really to debate except we're voting as members of a body politic or a species or social creatures or whatever. We're voting to try to get ourselves in line with what we like and what we dislike, something like that. And he comes along, he says, well, there's consequences to that. I mean, you could never really have an argument, right? You said discuss it and try to get your feelings in line. That makes sense, but you can't really have an argument. If you understand that it's true, if you were correct, that all you're doing is saying boo or yay to various things and that there's no content to argue about, then you should stop trying to make those arguments? Like, what are we doing when we talk like that all the time? And at first you might say, well, the emotivist could say, yeah, that was my whole point. My whole point was we're wrong every time we do that sort of thing. But it's possible to make an argument that says, okay, you said the words only mean X, but they can't possibly only mean X if the consequences of them only mean X make utter nonsense out of the way that we actually are using the words. That's probably the fairest. That's the closest I've gotten to accurately saying what the reasoning might potentially be here. He could just be listing off a bunch of weird things and then giving his argument later. But this happens a lot. You'll see it a lot in these types of discussions. So let's go on and wait for him to make his point. But all right, so he's saying, the statements are different every time you utter them. There's nothing to really disagree with about between them. They're really just statements about your feelings. So there's no factual evidence. It's not like imagine two people get together to have a debate about whether or not we should have reparations, and they bring up historical facts and they bring up statistical facts and they counter each other with different bits of evidence. And what's being said here in this argument is why the hell are they doing that? The only facts that could possibly be relevant are it's true that I feel this way. I hooked myself up to a blood pressure machine, and every time I think about reparations, ooh, it makes me angry. See, there's some evidence that it's true that I don't like it. Well, clearly that's not what the person means when they say yes for reparations or no for reparations. It's just I feel good about this or I feel bad about this, because how could that possibly be what it is if they're not the type of evidence they would bring, what makes the debates meaningful to them. It's clear that that's not what they understand it to mean. But you might say, well, everybody's confused, everybody's wrong. It's like it's not exactly immediately clear what kind of an argument you're making when you say, well, everybody's engaged in something, but they could all be wrong. But what he's saying is, let's look at how the words are used and realize that they can't possibly really be translated in this way, right? If you are more accurate about the quality of ethical judgments, you should be able to enter that debate and do fine, but you couldn't, right? We'd have person from this side, person from that side. They'd be bringing up evidence and making arguments, and then you'd get up there and you would talk about your blood pressure, right? And everybody would look at you like, how is that relevant? Well, I get very upset when I think about not giving reparations. It makes me very, very angry. Yeah, no, we get that. But did you have an argument about why we should feel differently about it? And he goes, oh no, you guys, I thought you understood. All you're doing is just getting up one right after another and saying, I feel this way. Okay. And then he makes this other point, which is, why would you try to persuade somebody? You have no evidence that you could possibly use to say you should feel differently than you do. So why have the debate in the first place? Right? It's like, maybe you're saying, well, if I give you enough reasons, then you might have different feelings towards the thing. But the whole point of the emotivist position is that the statements about what's right and wrong are not actually about things. He's saying that can't possibly be the case. It can't be, because it wouldn't make any sense to have debates in the first. All right, so let's move on. I think I'm beating that to death. All right. At any rate, they sometimes do. And on The View under discussion, they could, when asserted by different people, never do so. Fourthly, no argument or rational discussion could go between. All right. Fifthly, I could not, while asserting an ethical belief, conceive that I might possibly be wrong in this belief and yet be certain that I now feel or tend to feel disapproval. Since it is quite clear that I can conceive this, in some cases at least, this argument provides another reductio ad absurdum of the theory. All right. So he actually maybe doesn't think he's making the argument that I think is the one he was making earlier. He thinks he's making a reductio ad absurdum, which it's pretty clear what it means. But you take the consequences of the idea and you say, you reduce them to an absurdity that nobody wants to agree with. You say, well, you can't be right here because the consequences of if you were right, it would also mean this, and it would also mean this, and it would also mean that. And then if obviously we know what reductio ad absurdum means. So to think that an ethical belief now expressed by me may possibly be wrong is not the same as thinking that I may come in the future to have different feelings. For I think that the present judgment may be wrong and not a future one. To put the objection in another way, it would follow from the theory that to say, if I feel approval of A is always right, good, is to utter a tautology. But if it is not, it is a piece of gross conceit, if made in any ordinary context. Even if it were true that if I feel approval of A, I should always at the time judge A to be right. This is quite a different statement. I need not always be certain that my judgments are correct, unless judgment is so defined as to cover only cases of knowledge. All right. Not only does it not make sense for us to argue about ethical concepts or judgments, but it doesn't even make sense that we should ever imagine we're wrong about them. If all they really mean is I feel a certain way, could that really be all it means? He's trying to say the way you're using the word, what the word means to you is not what you're pretending you think the word means. Because when you say, I think murder is wrong, maybe you also don't like murder. Maybe there's a lot of emotional reason why you're happy to say boo to murder. But when you say that in your own mind, you're not thinking to yourself, isn't it fun to remember I have feelings? And maybe one day I won't feel this way and then I'll say it's right. But when I say it's right, all I'm saying is I don't feel that way. And so I don't feel that way because that's all it means, right? That's what he means by it's a tautology. To say, I don't like murder, therefore murder is wrong, is actually to say, I don't like murder, therefore I don't like murder, if the emotivists are correct, right? But there's clearly, so he's taking all these statements and saying they don't mean what you know they mean. So stop pretending that all they mean is boo or yay. All right, it's pretty clear. We don't have to beat it to death. Um, Sixthly, it would follow from the theory under discussion that when I judge that Hitler was bad or acted wrongly, I am not really talking about Hitler at all, but about my own psychology. To me, the consequences that I have mentioned are all quite incredible and constitute a fully sufficient reductio ad absurdum of the theory from which they are deduced. They hold whether it is applied both to good and to right, or only to one of them. Okay, so this is another admirable thing about the way he's writing. He's saying, look, here's the battlefield as I see it. Here's what I'm going to defend. Here's some arguments I have against one of the opponents. And then after he makes that argument, he says, I think I've just proven my point. Now, you might say, well, why are you? We get it. You made your argument. We heard your argument. But it's almost like signing it off. It's like, okay, I've done my job. Now you can attack me again. Now you can respond, and this is where I'm standing. And I not only fired these shots, but I think those shots are sufficient for me to have won that thing, and I'm claiming it so that you can actually say, hey, it's insufficient for these reasons, and then you won't have to worry about me going, well, I didn't make my full point yet, or something, right? It's like this is, I think, enough to make the point that I wanted to make against the emotivists. I don't know why we're distracted by the way he's writing, but it's admirably straightforward and that's quite useful. All right. All right, so that's the case against subjectivism as he sees it. And he seems to have been working on the emotivist subjectivist perspective, which was also the one that was advocated by Bertrand Russell, mostly in the essay we just finished. So now he's going to give the case against objectivism. Let us now examine the case against the objectivity of ethical judgments. If it is conclusive, we shall have to be subjectivists, in the sense that we shall have to admit the impossibility of making any true or at least any justified ethical judgments, even if we do not admit that ethical judgments are of the nature that they could not conceivably be true at all or true of anything but the mental state or dispositions of the speaker. Okay, so before attacking a different type of subjectivist, he's going to say, look, let's see if the attacks against objectivity stand. If we can destroy, I attacked the emotivists. I said, look, that's nonsense. You can't reduce it to just something like that. But I haven't proven objectivity. What if objectivity of ethical statements also fails? Well, maybe we'll have to be skeptics. Maybe we'll have to say This is beyond our knowing, and it's possible that there's true objective ethical judgments out there, but we won't ever have them. And so I'll still lose my ground up here if the arguments against objectivity, it's not enough to defeat subjectivity in the way he conceived it. Objectivity also has to be something that can't be completely demolished. So, one argument is based on the striking differences in ethical views between different people. But the differences between the views of savages and those of modern scientists about eclipses, or between the views of different politicians as to the causes and likely effects of contemporary events, are as great as the differences between the views of savages and of Christians, or of the views of Democrats and of Nazis as to ethics. Are we to conclude from this that the scientists are no more right than the savages, or that the political events about which the disputes turn have not objectively any causes or effects? If we do not draw this conclusion here, why draw the corresponding conclusion about ethics? There are also various ways of explaining the differences of view that exist without casting doubt on the objectivity of ethics. In the first place, acts which bear the same name may be very different acts in different states of society because the circumstances and the psychology of the people concerned are very different. So, it might be the case that, for example, slavery or polygamy was right as the course which involved least evil in certain more primitive societies and wrong in ours. This is quite compatible, if it were true, with the objectivity of ethical judgments. The proposition that slavery was right in ancient Egypt would not contradict the proposition that it was wrong in the United States in 1850 AD. Both we and the ancient Egyptians may be right in our ethical judgments. Let us, however, take cases where one party is wrong. All right, so that was clear what he was saying, right? He was not making a subjectivist argument. I'll pause for a second just in case there's any confusion. He's not saying sometimes slavery is right and sometimes it's wrong because it's all subjective. What he's saying is if you're living in a time and place where people will starve to death unless you take care of them, and the only way you can afford to take care of them is the expectation that they will do chores when you ask them to, right? If, like, in other words, if the situation in a certain time and place is weighing slavery against just killing the people since there's no way that they can coexist with you, well, then slavery might have been the least of the evils. It might have been the right choice in that setting. But if that's not the situation that you're in, then slavery is immoral. And that doesn't mean that it's not objective. Both of those statements could be objective, right? There's lots of things to consider, is all he's saying. So there's a difference between saying there's lots of things to consider and that can change things. Now, of course, you could easily make an ethical argument that says slavery is always wrong no matter what the circumstances are, right? That's still completely available. But what he's saying is, yeah, but sometimes you would say that something is right to do in this circumstance and wrong to do in another circumstance, and that's not the same as subjectivity. It's the circumstances that are different. All right. But then he says, let's move to a different one where one party is actually wrong. Now, it is important to note that differences in ethical beliefs are often due to differences of opinion as to matters of fact. If A and B differ as to the likely consequences of an action, they may well differ as to whether the action is wrong or right. And this is perhaps the most fertile source of disputes about what is right. But it is not an ethical difference at all. It is a difference such as arises between rival scientific predictions based on inductive evidence. Differences, or apparent differences of opinion, of these two kinds obviously constitute no possible argument against the objectivity of ethics, right? So he's now making another point that says, look, this might look like subjectivity. It might look like there's no objectivity to this, but I'm showing you that that doesn't demolish objectivity. There's still objective. It could still be that ethical statements can be objectively true, despite the fact that people differ about what the right thing is to do. And sometimes the source of that disagreement is that the circumstances are different, as he said before. But sometimes the source of the disagreement is that it is uncertain what the consequences of the action will be. And person A thinks that, certain consequences are more likely, and person B thinks different consequences are more likely. And of course, the consequences have to factor in, or maybe they have to factor in to whether or not you think the thing is right or wrong. There's certainly a dispute there, but it's not a dispute where you say, okay, one person could be wrong and another person could be right. But what would make them right or wrong would be they were correct about the facts of what would happen if that action took place, but both of them don't even have an ethical disagreement with each other, right? Person A could say, well, look, if you were right that doing X is going to lead to those consequences, then I agree with you. Doing X is the right thing to do, but you're wrong about that. It would lead to these other consequences. And person B could say, well, I have no ethical disagreement with you. If you were right that it would lead to those other consequences instead of these, I would agree with you that it's wrong to do the thing, but I don't think that it's going to lead to those consequences. Here's my reason. So they're having a dispute, but it's a dispute about what's likely to happen, which is not the same as an ethical dispute, he's saying. Okay. But there are also, beyond that, actual genuine ethical differences. That is, differences as to our judgments, not of fact, but of virtue, but of value. These may sometimes be explained by differences in people's experience of life. If I never experience A, I cannot realize the intrinsic goodness of A and may therefore wrongly subordinate it to something less good. And we must remember that what is intrinsically good is not a physical thing or a physical act, but the experience or state of mind associated with it. Even a long study of philosophical books would not qualify a person to pass a judgment on the intrinsic value of philosophy if he were hopelessly bad at the subject. Because then, however many books he read, he would not have a genuinely philosophical experience. Two persons who differ as to the aesthetic value of a picture may really be judging about different things. There's several experiences of it, or at least their judgments will be based on different data. Other differences of view may be due to the misapplication of principles previously accepted, or to genuine intellectual confusions, such as the philosopher or even the man of common sense who is not a philosopher could remove. For instance, a man may confuse badness and wrongness and conclude or assume, for example, that because he really sees lying to be always bad, meaning an evil, he sees it to be always wrong. Well, it may be the case of choosing the lesser evil rather than the greater. Often a man will think that he knows intuitively P to be R when he really only sees it to be Q, but confuses Q with R. All right. So the first attack against objectivism that he's trying to answer is this idea that look at how many different ethical inclinations we have. We have all these different cultures. In Japan, young people sit down when an elder walks into the room as a sign of showing him respect. But in the West, we stand when an elder walks into the room to show him respect. And the you know well, in both, we do something physical to demonstrate respect for the elder. So there's a universality there. But um, in this specific tribe, you are praised for stealing from your neighbors and getting away with it. Whereas in this other tribal system, the entire culture raises people with the exact opposite idea that it's always wrong to steal, and you should especially be treating the neighbor or the stranger, the person who's from outside your culture, especially well, and not stealing from them. It's like, well, okay, how do you have an entire nation of people who have a completely opposite ethical inclination and education, and they raise their children to feel this other way, and you say, hey, uh, this guy I know, he went to the neighboring tribe and he stole a whole bunch of stuff and brought it back. And the guy looks at you like, whoa, really? What an awesome dude. And you go to this other person, say, hey, do you know that Phil, he left and he went to some neighboring tribe and he stole a bunch of their valuable things and brought them back and he didn't even get caught. And they look at you horrified, like, what the heck? It's like, well, how can we have such radically different ethical views? So he's bringing up that idea. How is there so much disagreement? He says, well, okay, yeah, there's lots of disagreement. First, there's lots of disagreement in science. There's lots of disagreement in politics. There's lots of disagreement in all sorts of areas. And there's lots of disagreement that comes from cultural differences. And we don't just give up on all those other subjects So why should we give up on ethics? Why should that suggest to us, instead of suggesting to us, wow, these are complicated questions and there's all sorts of different things we have to fight about and try to work out, like we would do with politics, right? Like, hey, this nation over here thinks that guns should be illegal. This nation over here put it in its constitution that the people have a right to own them. Whoa, that's radically different. I guess there's no objective truth about whether or not people should be free or how to constitute a government. It's like, no, we don't give up on politics. We just have the debates and we go in lots of different fields, comparative politics. We do all sorts of different things to try to settle the question. So, how come ethics is the special one where you're saying, ooh, look at all the disagreement? It must not be about anything. And then he says, and furthermore, let's take these disagreements and realize some of them are not really ethical disagreements. They're disagreements about what the likely consequences are or the facts. Let's also notice that some of the ones that look like ethical disagreements really are just differences based on the circumstances actually surrounding the actions, where, we could all agree about the likely effects of the actions, but in this circumstance, it's better. It's like, well, we don't have to give more examples. So he's saying, like, look, those aren't really a challenge to the objectivity of ethics, and that's a big third of the whole thing. They're not really a challenge to it. So you thought there was a lot of disagreement, but a lot of these disagreements don't even come close to challenging the idea that maybe these ethical judgments could have an objective quality to them. And we won't rehearse the rest of what he says here. Okay. So again, he's just defending against that first attack, or the judgment that something is good or bad on the whole may have been due to concentrating attention on one side of it while ignoring or understand. So he's done this a few times now. He's saying you could just be bad at thinking, or you could be very good at thinking and make a mistake in your thinking, right? That there's a whole bunch of source for disagreement, is that you made normal logical errors like people make all the time, and whole groups of people can make those errors. That doesn't mean that the thing you're talking about is meaningless. It just means, we've got a lot of sources for error in the way we think. Okay. As for instance, militarists concentrate their attention on the unselfish heroism which war brings out in men and forget or underestimate war's evils. Lesser degrees of such one sidedness it is impossible to avoid, and yet they may detrimentally influence ethical judgments. To decide what is right in a particular case is often a difficult matter of balancing the good or evil likely to be produced by one proposed act against that likely to be produced by others. For even if we do not hold the view that the rightness of an act depends solely on its consequences, which it sounds like he might think, we cannot in any case deny that such balancing of the consequences should play the predominant part of at least many ethical decisions. Sure. Perhaps if we foresaw all the consequences clearly as they would be in their factual character and could keep our attention fixed equally on them all, we should always be in agreement as to the degree to which they were good or evil as compared with the consequences of the other possible acts. But apart from the difficulty of estimating what the consequences of an act will be, it is practically impossible in cases which are at all complex to keep our attention sufficiently fixed at the same time on all the foreseeable consequences likely to be seriously relevant for good or evil. And so we are likely, through lack of attention, to underestimate the value or disvalue of some as compared to others. Okay, so he's bringing up one of the intrinsic complications of the subject, right? It's like if somebody said, hey, for 100 years, biologists have been debating and disagreeing about certain questions. It's like, well, they're complicated questions. It doesn't mean that biology isn't a real science talking about something. That's his point. Okay. The lack of attention I have mentioned is in some degree inevitable, but it is greatly enhanced by the influence of desire and prejudice. It is a commonplace that ethical mistakes are often due to non-intellectual factors. Whether these act only through affecting the attention or whether they can lead to mistaken valuations, even in the presence of full attention to the object valued, we need not discuss. Their influence is certainly not confined to ethical mistakes. We may note the different conclusions as to the factual consequences of a policy, which members of different political parties may draw. Okay, we were talking about how admirably he writes and his straightforwardness of saying, here's what I want to argue. Here's how I define the opponent. Here's what I think is an attack. Here's my statement that I think that's a sufficient attack, right? One of the things that he does, which I do, that's maybe a little bit more negative in the writing style, is that he tries to fit a lot of ideas into each sentence. Let's read this sentence again. Their influence is certainly not confined to ethical mistakes. We may note, this is all one sentence, we may note the different conclusions as to the factual consequences of a policy which members of different political parties may draw from the same evidence. There is, in any case, a large class of errors for which some form of psychoanalysis, I do not say necessarily the Freudian, is required rather than argument, and another, probably much larger, of which it can be said only that the person in question fell into error because he did not steadfastly will to seek the truth and therefore did not fix his attention on points which displeased him. Okay, we understand about this. This says I have to add you back in. Okay, sorry about that. So, the squeezing in of parentheticals is something that I do way too much, and I think he's doing it a lot. One of the things here's a fun side note. A nice trick when you're reading a philosopher and it feels like, oh man, this sentence has too much crammed into it and I can't follow it. Just take out the parentheticals, and they're not always in parentheses. Sometimes they're in commas, right? So we can read it again and say there is, in any case, right? Another way of doing it is to just really pause and then read rapidly the parenthetical, right? There is, in any case, a large class of errors for which some form of psychoanalysis, I do not necessarily say Freudian, is required rather than argument. And another, probably much larger, of which it can be said only that the person in question fell into error because he did not steadfastly will to seek the truth and therefore did not fix his attention on points which displeased him. All right. I really have been praising the structure of his paper, right? The way to come into an academic argument and say, look, here's the battleground. Here's how I'm going to define the lines. Here's where I'm going to stand. Here's me attacking them. Here's my say, right? All of that's really, really good. If you find a writer who you think could have written a 7-line sentence like the one we just read in 1 or 2 lines, and you want to know, or if you find that you do that a lot, uh, Strunk and White, Elements of Style. We'll talk about that another day. Awesome little book. Read it once a year. Okay. The convictions of some people as to the objectivity of ethics appear to have been shaken by the fact that enthusiastic Nazis seem to have believed that it was their duty to do things which we are convinced are completely wrong, such as ill-treating the Jews. But is there any reason to think that these Nazis really wanted to arrive at the truth regarding the question whether it was right or wrong to send Jews to concentration camps? If not, we need not be so surprised that they did not attain the truth which they did not seek. All right, let's pause there for a second. One of the fun things we can do is have a meta ethical discussion here and say, look, there's a historical context in which this debate of subjectivity and objectivity is happening in ethics here. And so let's briefly recount that history. Yesterday, we should say this. Everybody go subscribe to GadSad, and he started to do free online classes. Last night he did one on evolutionary psychology. It's really awesome. You should do everything you can to subscribe and encourage him to do more of those. It's unbelievably valuable and will be. When he was doing it, he mentioned Margaret Mead. There's a historical context here that goes into, Boaz and Mead, and we should talk about it because this essay and this debate is within that intellectual context, which is in that historical context, and it's this. In the early part of the previous century, there were a great many people who were just balls to the walls impressed by the discovery that genes exist. And the nature side of the nature-nurture debate kind of got an adrenaline shot in the forehead. That's not just the Nazis. Americans, if you well, they're probably no longer alive. If you know a 100-year-old, they probably had books on eugenics on their coffee table if they were, like, middle class. Like, those would be the things people were really excited about. "Ooh, look, birth control. We should think about how to and family planning," all of this stuff. Formula was invented for babies at the time. There's a lot of this scientific this intellectual trend went in a direction where the scientists can write a formula, right? That's where the word formula comes for baby formula, right? Where it's like not only was scientism, but it was very much inclined towards the we've got it, we can have it all figured out. You are the expression of your genes. We found your blueprint. This is the way, and it was capturing the imagination. It was in, television shows and, sci-fi books and the ideas that people, just like we talk about AI and Terminator stuff all the time right now, they were massively taken with this idea that like of algeny in a sense, but also eugenics. Okay. So the Nazis took it a little too far. We all know what happened. And there was a massive swing in the opposite direction. Okay. So there were people who basically said, no, it's all Kronos and he can eat his kids if they don't come out right, kind of thing. It's all defined for you. There's nothing you can do to change your nature. All we have to do is ask the scientists to tell us what your nature is, and then we'll know you should be over here and you should be in a concentration camp and you should be working, and we should definitely sterilize people like you because we have enough of those types. And like, why did we have the confidence to do all this crazy stuff? It's because the intellectual, actually, a better way of putting it would be the intellectual fads. Evinced the kind of drunkenness that happens when you first discover something that seems that does give insight into something that hitherto was too complicated to make sense of. And we'll talk about that on its own. We won't go any more into it now, but in another session we'll talk about climate change and we'll talk about other subjects that have this is what people do. It's like this whole field is too complicated. We can't make sense out of it. Suddenly somebody recognizes a connection between two things and it's like, that's it. That defines everything. And we're sure of it. And we go way into that extreme. And then, of course, the pendulum swings the other way. And so what happened was after it went too far, it swung too far the other way. And you had Boaz and Margaret Mead. And these were people who had the blank slate theory. You aren't your genes. You're a blank slate. You're born as you could be anything. You could be anything that we decide to turn you into through our cultural. It's all nurture and no nature. Okay, well, obviously it's a synthesis of the two. You could have predicted it from beforehand, but we had to have decades of suffering and stupidity and insanity to slowly get ourselves there. I'm sorry, Savad, you put your camera on. Does that mean you wanted to talk?
Well, I was going to say you're talking about eugenics, maybe not. I mean, that started way before that, though, right? Maybe not from a scientific standpoint, but the Greeks or other cultures would value babies. If there are any deficiencies, anything like that, then I mean, they would get rid of them, right?
Oh
So,
yeah. There's nothing new under the sun, right? Like, so it's not like,
but
yeah.
you're just saying it was brought to another level using science to, okay.
So the that's a good question. I'll be very clear in how I answer it regarding what I was saying. The trend to overemphasize nature and create hell, or to overemphasize nurture and create a different hell, that's a thing that's just a part of being human that goes back forever.
Right.
What happened was when we discovered the double helix, when we discovered the genes, we thought we did have an empirical revelation about a mechanism that was on the nature side of things. And because of that, we got drunk in that trend, right? So this pendulum can swing without that happening, right? I thank you for asking that question to clarify. Absolutely 100%. That's all we're ever doing is trying to find the right balance between it's a synthesis thing.
Right.
So it's not that it was the first time people got drunk on a nurture or a nature idea, but rather what I'm saying is from the history of science or the philosophy of science, this is something that is, maybe it's an anthropological point I'm making, but scientists and cultures that get really excited about the thing the scientist is saying and then misinterpret it and run wild with it. uh that's the mechanism I'm talking about, within, like you correctly said, is a broader pattern that doesn't require that mechanism to exist.
Okay.
That's all I meant, and that's exactly correct. I don't know if I'm correct exactly, but that question, yeah. Okay, so what happened after that is we said, "Oh no, oh no, look at what we've done." let's let's counterbalance it. And you had the blank slate theorists who are basically saying, so we'll give an example. Margaret Mead, we've brought her up a few times, not trying to pick on the poor lady, but she was a student of Boaz, and she went out to sort of write books, and these would be the books that would be on people's coffees tables, right? So just a few decades later, we're swinging in the other direction. And so she wrote a book called Coming of Age in Samoa, where she said, look, we just need to look at ourselves. Our culture's weird. We're Victorian, we're repressed, we've got all these bad guilt feelings and shame and fear regarding sex. And so we've got all these psychology libraries full of psychology books that we write about puberty and all of this stuff because we're making our own problems. We don't need these problems. We could solve all these problems. Look at the people of Samoa. I went there. I lived amongst them. I observed them carefully like a good scientist. And I'm not saying she wasn't being a good scientist, right? I'm trying to talk about a broader trend that sort of captures us anthropologically as we're trying to figure things out. She goes and she makes these observations and she interviews people and she writes this book and she says, in Samoa, the young girls go through puberty and they don't have any angst at all. It's so beautiful. Just people are nude, they're lying under the palm trees, the sun is shining down, and they don't have any of this Victorian Christian guilt, shame stuff. We make all these complexes for ourselves, but we could be living like that. And so people were really taken and they got drunk in this other direction, right? It's like, well, we needed a counterbalance, right? So we're talking about the historical context where these conversations are fitting in. So we we we're running in the opposite direction. Holy shit. World wars, hell, concentration camps. This is not what we want. We thought we were about to bring about heaven on earth with this new discoveries of ours, and we get drunk and mad in that direction. Holy crap, let's run the other way. What do? We run off a different cliff. So she writes this book, and it's on everybody's coffee table, and everybody's all interested in the hippie movement, all this great stuff and whatever. So in the 1980s, some scholars decided that they thought that maybe there was something not quite correct about her findings. Not that she fabricated or made it up or anything horrible like that. No reason to say she wasn't being a very genuine and a good and careful scientist. But they went back in the 80s with some hindsight, and they went to the same islands and Samoa. They went back to Samoa, and they even interviewed some of the same people who were now much older that she had interviewed before. And their report was, we thought that lady was crazy. We would lie to her just for fun. Like, she was asking us all these questions, and we thought it was amusing to tell her things. And they're like, oh, really? Okay, well, that's problematic because she just took your reports, but she also studied and carefully noted things. And so we're going to do that a little bit and see what's going on. And what they discovered was that young girls who were going through puberty in Samoa go to bed absolutely terrified every single night, like worse than an anxiety attack that you can imagine, because the young boys, hoping that these young girls will become sexually active, have the habit of sneaking into their tents and poking their hymens with their fingers to break them so that they'll be more they'll be more persuadable for sexual encounters. So in any case, they discovered some things and wrote some things that very much counteracted the other narrative, which, again, we're not picking on Margaret Mead. We're just saying historically, what the heck's going on here? Well, it's this drunk pendulum of being like, we've got it figured out because we found one thing that connects to one other thing. And that's the first thing we have that can make sense of anything. So it must make sense of everything. And then you get the emergence of the exact opposite principle to the extreme to counterbalance that. And for damn good reason, right? I mean, it's like, thank God for Margaret Mead. Thank God somebody's trying to provide, we could just be in 1,000-year Reich hell if we never had a counterattack. But what happens is the actual truth is a synthesis, right? The actual truth is you're partly nature and you're partly nurture, and we need to, figure out how they interplay and dance with each other. But the extremes, for Margaret Mead, you're a blank slate. You're nothing except what we train you to be by the way we teach. And so you could raise boys to be girls and girls to be boys and all of that sort of thing. And on the other side, it doesn't matter what you say or do. I've got your genes and your eye color and your hair color, and I can figure out that you're one of these types. And because we have all our science, or at least to justify it through science, we can place you where you're supposed to be, and we know how the future should be, and blah, blah, blah. Okay. So it's a very brief, that's the historical context here. And these ethical discussions about the objectivity or subjectivity of moral values is happening in that context as well. And he brings it up and he says, look, the Nazis were enthusiastic and obviously it caused us to say, now, wait a minute, hold on a second. It seems like they thought they were doing good. And that really shook us up a lot because we're pretty sure they were not doing good. And we defeated them in a world war to say, stop that. You guys aren't good. But then we imagined, he says, that they thought that they were doing the most good possible, that they were aimed at the good. And so if you can have that much disagreement about ethics, maybe the solution is to say, well, ethics is just subjective and we shouldn't be too confident about anything because look how confident the Nazis were. That's essentially what he's saying is the psychological potential, let's say fuel on the fire, at least, for moving towards subjectivity on this question. And then his answer to it, which we can discuss how much we are convinced by it, is to say that actually, why are we presuming that the Nazis were aimed at the good? Maybe they wanted destruction. Maybe they wanted hell. Maybe they were conscious of the fact that they wanted that or something. So that was his way of excusing that to take away some of the fire for saying, hey, if it's a solution to Nazis, let's just be subjectivists. That's a historical context. I'm going to shut up now. Go ahead.
So you could say that those two are two prime examples from both camps of confirmation bias that have turned to self-fulfilling prophecies for each of them, right? It's like, so Margaret Mead discovered this.
Yeah.
And then
yep.
It was like, oh, this is totally counter to what we thought, and then may have been just totally siloed with what she was focusing on because that's the result she wanted. And you could say the same thing for the Nazis. Is it just became this self-fulfilling prophecy of, well, it's totally this would be more nurture, right? Because they're controlling the genetics, and so we know how everything
nature
of how everything is going to work out, and went all in, and then they were obviously there's problems on both sides.
Yeah. Okay. Absolutely. So, and he's hinted at the idea that, look, we're just not good thinkers. That doesn't mean ethics isn't about something. It just means we make a lot of mistakes along the way. That's not evident. So he said, look, you can be biased. Obviously, we're all biased.
Right.
And you can be, I've been trying to say, drunk on an idea that seems so, powerful and amazing, or you can be so fearfully running away from those drunk lunatics that you go off and all you see is whatever contradicts it. And you don't see the fact that there are germs of truth, right? On both of these extremes are completely wrong, but they're wrong because they're ideologically possessed by a germ of truth. And that the heavenly place to be is the one that takes and synthesizes and makes sense of the germ of truth that got people hot and bothered in the first place without making it the god of everything and the only principle that applies, which is where it goes off the rails, right?
Yeah, it's just, it's interesting that there's these examples, yet we still to this day will fall where people are going completely all in, being aware of these missteps that groups before them have made in the past, but
Yeah.
think that somehow they're just gung-ho on going 100% in becoming, it's almost, they're gooning to this, like they have, I have it, and then it's everything, and become delusional.
Yep. Yeah, there's no humility. There's no intellectual humility. One of the reasons why it's so important, I think, to do philosophy is that we can govern or we can examine these facts about ourselves. Also, anthropology and psychology have a lot to say on these things, and we should look at what they have to offer when we're trying to figure this out. But just studying history, and part of doing philosophy is the philosophy of biology is this of studying the history of biology. To study philosophy is to study the history of philosophy necessarily. And so, but it's amazing what you can learn about yourself by studying history. And here's something I realized the other day. You know what the most conservative, traditional, well-established, ancient human what's the word I'm trying to look for here? Consistently human thing to do is this is tradition. The tradition, the thing that's most traditional about being human is that when you're 20, you decide that everybody before you was a fuddy-duddy and you've got a new idea. That's every generation. That's like you live in this time. It's like, oh, the kid's got some new ideas. It's like, yeah, that's redundant. That's why we call them kids. They know nothing. So like they think that they got all these new ideas. It's like, yeah, so did in 362 BC, the young Athenians felt exactly the same way. That's nothing new. I actually saw something on Twitter of it was like a trans movement, and it was an old black and white photo from like the 1930s or something in America. It was like men wearing dresses and being like, "Don't judge me, I'm who I am," or whatever. It was like, okay, there's nothing new under the sun, and we are the creatures that we are. And what's awesome about this is actually what's really awesome about studying history is you start to really understand. It's funny. We think to ourselves, I'm alive and I'm making decisions, and those decisions will affect the future. That's how we go through life. And then we never pause and say, oh, my grandmother and grandfather were humans and they made decisions, and here I am. Like, I'm the product of the past. If I can make the future be something, I'm also the consequences of the people who came before that were trying to make something. And so you can't really know yourself, I don't think, unless I should study history way more than I have. But what I have detected from some studies in history is that it'll get you out. It'll give you that humility and get you out of the delusions of thinking there's something unique and new happening today with AI and all of this. It's like, these are people. They just look like people. They look like ancient Athenians to me, having exactly the same goddamn discussions, expecting heaven to be right around the corner and creating hell while trying to do it, and then having it all collapse because it's not sustainable, and then rebuilding again. It's like nothing new.
Yeah, it reminds me of, I can't remember the philosopher we read where it was basically Darwin before Darwin.
Paley.
Paley, yeah.
I looked it up the other day. Path made me look it up. Paley died in 1805. Darwin was born in 1809. We reread the sentence. It was like, holy shit. I mean,
Yeah.
it was really, I mean, I want to read it again because I was so shocked when we read it and I did not expect it to be there. But for those who are wondering what we're talking about, I'm going to quickly grab one sentence from a different section in Philosophy 101 where we were looking at the existence of God and we looked at the design arguments from Paley. We won't give the whole background. You probably know who it is. But we're going to say, okay, who's this Paley guy? Where is this here? The problem of evil. Da, da, da. Okay, wait a minute before that. Okay. Come on. Here we go. So get this. This was written by, you know what? I won't give the whole preface. We've done it too many times. But if you knew who was writing this, you'd be even more impressed and shocked than just the fact that he died 4 years before Darwin was born. Here's an alternative answer to the question, which has the same effect as the resolving of things into chance. Which answer would persuade us to believe that the eye, the animal to which it belongs, every other animal, every plant, indeed every organized body which we see, are only so many out of the possible varieties and combinations of being which the lapse of infinite ages has brought into existence, that the present world is the relic of that variety, millions of other bodily forms and other species having perished, being by the defect of their constitutions incapable of preservation or of continuance by generation. Not only was he giving an alternative view to looking at how nature took its present form, but it's not that he was doing it in ignorance. That was shocking as hell to me. That idea was in ancient Egypt, probably. Actually, I would bet a large amount of money that idea was in ancient Egypt. Um, but moving away from that, because look, we're already on a tangent. We won't go into trying to support that or make it seem more reasonable than it probably sounds absurd at first. It's a great example of the fact that all the ideas are sort of there and we're having an ongoing conversation that has the effect of sophisticating things, perhaps. But some of the arrogance that leads us into errors in all sorts of subjects, including ethical discussions, and how we conceptualize ourselves and all those other things that are relevant to it, is the fact that we think what I just thought right now is new, when really what you just thought right now probably has been thought since you thought it. It's the sort of thing that people can think, and there's been a lot of people and a lot of time, and a lot of them have had that thought. So, in any case, we won't go down that road anymore. But if it's an error to say that everything in the past is exactly the way it is now, that's less of an error than to say things are radically different now than they've ever been. All right. So it may well be the case, we'll return to his argument in a second, but let's finish the last two paragraphs here. So it may well be the case that all differences in people's judgments, whether certain actions are right or wrong, or certain things good or bad, are due to factors other than an irreducible difference in ethical intuition. Okay. So he said, there's lots of different ideas, so let's just be relativists or subjectivists or whatever. He says, well, look, a lot of the disagreements don't have anything to do with differences in intuition. So he wants to boil it down and say, maybe if we all had these deep instinctive feelings that were totally at odds, you could have a germ of a point there. But most of our disagreements are about facts or about consequences, or maybe we're not even aimed at the good, or, he said there's lots of reasons for us to have disagreements. This isn't qualitatively more complicated than any other subject that has lots of disagreements in it, as far as he can tell. And that doesn't seem to me to be reason, he says, to think that this subject of ethics isn't about something. But even if they should not be, we must remember that ethical intuition, like our other capacities, is presumably a developing factor and therefore may be capable of error. But in any case, we have said enough to show that great differences of opinion as to ethics are quite compatible with the objectivity of ethical judgments. So he says, I think I've repelled that attack. Differences between philosophers about the general theory of ethics are remarkably great. But experience shows that very wide philosophical differences are quite compatible with striking agreement as regards to the kind of action judged right or wrong. Just as radical differences between philosophers in their theory of perception and of physical objects are quite compatible with complete agreement in ordinary life as to what particular physical objects are in a particular place at a particular time. The differences between philosophers are differences not mainly as to their ethical judgments in concrete ethical situations, but as to the general theory explaining these. Remember when we did our intro, we said we could slice into 4 sections. He's saying, look, another source of big disagreement is foundations, the foundations part of ethics, basing it in duty or in utility or in virtue or in God's orders or something. Those disagreements almost count as a point against your attack on me here, because notice, no matter how different they are, in all 4 camps, typically the advocate of that grounding view thinks murder is wrong. He proved it in a different way, and he thinks that the way you should prove it is different, and he thinks it's grounded in something that's basic, and that's different than what the other person thinks is basic and grounding it. But they both still conclude that murder is wrong. So, you could take a whole bunch of those really different disagreements and say those have nothing to do with us having different moral intuitions. And then he also, before that, he said, and we could have different moral intuitions to some degree. You could have a bruised conscience. Maybe, like the deontologist said, he called it, your ethical faculty needs to be cultivated and grown properly. Just because you have it doesn't mean that it doesn't require some education and some it's like, you like noise, you like music when you're a kid, but you don't know how to appreciate classical music. Maybe you need to have the right kind of education to develop that sort of taste, that type of thing. And so he says, so even if it was a disagreement in our deep intuitions, which mostly it isn't, look at how it's all based in these other things, he says, but even in the cases where it is, that's still compatible with the idea that, well, my eyes work, but I have optical illusions that fool me sometimes. And maybe you aren't fooled by that same optical illusion. It doesn't mean we deny that vision is a thing or electromagnetic radiation is a thing, right? So he's likening it to that. And then he says, just like the philosophers can have radical disagreements about the foundations of ethics, but still come to mostly the same ethical conclusions, which is, again, evidence against the thing that you thought it was. But, physicists have totally radical disagreements about how nature works. But if you ask them, will the lead weight fall down? They all come to the same conclusion. So there's an awful lot of agreement here, too. Despite the libraries full of books of disagreement about how to underpin it or whatever. So the differences between philosophers are differences not mainly as to their ethical judgments in concrete ethical situations, but as to the general theory explaining these. We may add that the differences between different people and different civilizations as to concrete ethical judgments are commonly exaggerated. David Livingstone says that nowhere had he need to teach the African savages, at any rate, the ethical as opposed to the religious portion of the Decalogue. All right. He's saying nobody needed to be told that murder was wrong. But there is, of course, a great inconsistency, not only amongst savages, in confining to a limited group rules which demand universal extension. But there is, of course, a great inconsistency in confining to a limited group rules which demand universal extension. Okay. So he's made an attack against subjectivism, and then he brought up an attack against objectivism and said, look, I'm going to repel that attack, right? And he did what he thought was a good, I'm not saying it wasn't, but he thought he attacked very well, and then he thought that he repelled an attack. And he said, look, if we can't repel the attack, even though subjectivism is not right or super weird and has all these weird consequences that I think nobody wants to accept, if objectivism doesn't stand, then we should just be skeptics. And he's calling that a different type of subjectivism because that's the way he defined it. So we'll just deal with that. We're not going to nitpick about that, and we're not going to be confused about what he's saying. He defined what he was saying. So we'll go with the way he's using the words when we interact with them. And that's very important to do. But in any case, he says, I still have to defend objectivism. And here's the main attack, is that it's all relative. That's really what he's getting at, is that we just have different instincts. And so it's not really about something that could ever be objective. And he takes all those disagreements. He says, well, half of them are like this, and another fourth of them are like that, and another eighth of them are really about this. And all of these disagreements are about foundations, but look at all the agreement that's connected to them. He says, all right. And there's a thin sliver of occasionally people have a different instinct. And you know what? That's fully compatible with them still being about something. Maybe the person's sick. Maybe they're a psychopath. Maybe they have different experiences, or they're blinded by their biases. Like, all of these different things explain those disagreements, and none of them make this look anything more contentious than politics or other subjects that we see lots of disagreement in, and yet we still think it's worth debating and that the subject's about something. Okay, so let's pause there right now. His next section is called The Argument from the Psychological Origins of Ethical Beliefs. Okay, so that'll be very interesting. So he's not satisfied with just repelling that one argument. He's going to say, what about people who say, I know ethics isn't about anything because I understand psychologically how you come to have the views that you have. And so therefore, since I understand that, they're not, we'll get into that and we'll see what he has to say about it. And then he says the role of intuition. And then that'll be the end of it. So maybe we'll pause there because we've gone pretty late, and this was a slightly long essay, and we'll pick up the rest of it tomorrow. There was a lot there, and there was a lot that I didn't go into tangents on, and there was a lot that we could still discuss. There was historical questions about the Nazis. There were psychological questions about the Nazis. There were historical questions about this word he kept using, savages, which I know would offend the tastes of most public discourse today. But we understood what he meant, so we didn't have to translate it in any way. Obviously, people with very different cultural upbringings and different dress and food and attitudes and religious mythology. He says, well, there's still a lot of overlap. They all don't need to be told murder is wrong, right? So he's just dealing with this ethics question here. He didn't mean savages in a pejorative sense in his mind. Okay, we understood what he meant, so we didn't get sidetracked by that. So I would like to ask Savad. We've read half of what he's written. How do you feel about him as a thinker and an arguer and a writer? What do you think about how well he made his case here so far? There's no wrong answers to this, obviously. I'm just curious about your feedback. Or Mark, if Savad is distracted. I see you unmuted yourself, but we can't hear you.
Yeah, I thought he.
Oh, there it is.
Thought he made a good case.
Yeah, we haven't finished it, so it might get even stronger. But he's certainly engaged, and he's he's not off topic. There's no crazy things he's saying here. How about we focus on his case against the subjectivism that really is emotivism, right? So he's saying subjectivism is anything that's not my objectivism, but that includes skepticism and emotivism and all sorts of different relativism. But when he's attacking subjectivism at first, he's attacking emotivism. He's saying the statement murder is wrong really means nothing other than boo, murder in a public setting or something like that. What did you think about his arguments? He had like 6 points he made, but they were all in the category that he calls reductio ad absurdum, which is saying, look, if that's true that you can take this and it really just means this, what are the consequences to the entire conversation we've been having? Have we just been in a fever dream imagining we were talking about stuff this entire time, but really we were just emoting and emoting and emoting? That seems pretty strange. And can we ever be wrong about an ethical statement if all it means is I feel a certain way? Of course you're right if you feel that way, unless you're very confused about your psychology, but that's got to be rare. And so why do we feel like I want to get my ethical statements correct if they're always correct by definition? And also, you can't really have the same one 10 seconds later because your new statement is, now I also feel that murder is bad. Boo. It's like, okay, one day you might not, and then you'll be right then too, just like you were right when you said you thought it was wrong. And your feelings change. That's all it's about. It's like, that doesn't seem like it's what it's about. So again, that's the nature of his argument, is saying the way we're talking about it doesn't sound like you can really translate those statements without everything looking absurd. What do you think about that as an argument?
I think what I said last time is a lot of that is, or the reason murder's wrong, outside of let's say outside of religious, religious teachings, just secularly speaking, it's kind of been democratically decided because nearly all people would believe that it's wrong. Then
So it's being settled
pretty
in a
much
group
universally-
discussion.
yeah, it's kind of universally accepted as being wrong, unlike some gray areas.
Okay, it's universally accepted. Does that mean it's objective in his definition of objective? Does that mean it's really true that it's wrong, or does it just mean that by and large people feel this way? And isn't that a nice consensus to have?
Yeah, he might say that.
Well, what
that
do you
it's-
say?
It's I think I'm biased, so I would say it's definitely wrong, and it's not up for debate. It's definitely wrong, but so he's trying to get down to the real meaning of why people think it's wrong, and a lot of times there is no answer to that. It's like, it's not just I feel it, it's I know it, and I don't know why, I just know.
Yeah,
think
he might
that's-
get to that. His last section's about the necessity of intuition. So like
Yep.
the deontologist we read, he might actually get into that.
I think I'd approach it, as I mentioned last time, for a more pragmatic point of saying, well, let me murder your only child. And then that's the end of, let's say, your bloodline. What kind of effect does that have on your family? And yeah, it's going to make you feel bad, and you may want revenge, and then it could just turn into this out bloodlust between two groups, and nobody wins. It also reminds me when he's talking about, when you say I don't like murder, but you don't like murder. I think a lot of it is people will base some of their views on how they're feeling, and not really unlayer of why and what that means. It also reminds me of the quote from Ben Shapiro of, like, facts don't care about your feelings. But then it's
But the question is, can we have ethical facts? I mean, if it
right, that's would be another conversation. But well, it would be, I guess, right. I mean, what do you go back to? Like, what are you aiming towards? Do you want to have a society that can get along and build and be cohesive and work together, have different groups work together? Because if murder can certainly have a negative impact and can certainly take away from the aim. Now two groups are aiming at each other instead of working together to towards this collective goal that they're both aiming for.
So
Right, and everyone, sane people want. Sorry, did I interrupt?
no, you're good.
Oh no, go ahead.
Sane people. Okay, yeah, sane people want society to work because that's in their best interest, and therefore you have the things like the golden rule, which is a good example of what we're talking about with well, I don't do that because I wouldn't like it if the same things were done to me in that circumstance, and therefore
does that make it wrong?
I don't benefit.
So it sounds like you're saying that murder isn't useful.
That alone wouldn't.
It'd be unproductive, right? You could say there's two groups that are trading. One has corn, one has potatoes. I go and I murder this group that is, now we can't make a trade. Now it's not only a negative effect because we can't trade anymore, but has a negative effect upon our tribe or culture or our group. Now we have one less thing to barter with for another group, or one less something, one less thing to consume. And now,
Doesn't that? I'm going to play devil's advocate because I heard a hint of what you were saying that's aiming at an actual pragmatist approach. I want to push on Mark because I'm not sure he is. So let me take what you just said, Savad, but throw it at Mark really quickly here and say, doesn't that just reduce our ethical conversation to the things I like or things that would be good for me that I would prefer to happen less often or more often because it's in my benefit? Does that make them actually right or wrong? Like when we say something is wrong, we think we mean something beyond that, I think. And the subjective, I think I think this isn't your full position, by the way, Mark, but I think the things that we've been saying just now would be a subjectivist attitude towards ethics. Unless you're saying the ultimate good is to have the largest number of people working together, but it's not clear what the argument is for that. Murder is wrong because I wish to not have it happen to me, and the odds that it will happen to me are decreased if everybody around me understands that they shouldn't be doing it. Is that sufficient to say it's actually wrong
saying,
objectively, the way
we're looking at
this writer has been arguing?
right. Yeah. So you're saying that the benefits, we're looking at it in one way, is the benefits of cooperation. You know, I succeed if you succeed, and vice versa. And we, it's helpful if we don't do certain negative things that will have negative effects. But
so you would like to succeed. So it sounds like what you're saying could be reduced to boo, murder. I don't want more of that. I'm not sure what I'm saying is fair, by the way. I'm trying to play devil's advocate. I'm not sure that that's really fair, but I want to play the devil's advocate and let you try to, go back against it a bit.
Okay.
So, yeah, go ahead.
Well, so let's say something that's inherently wrong. It's more than just because you don't like it, but it's because it would be harming someone in such a way that goes beyond
it's intrinsically wrong.
Goes beyond just an inconvenience. You're taking away someone's existence.
So, okay, so you want to say it's really intrinsically wrong. So if I told you that there was a really nasty drug addict, homeless dude who for the last 40 years, every day has made everybody's life worse that he's encountered, and mostly he doesn't even encounter people, and that I can tell you with certainty that he's going to live another 10 years, and every day for the next 10 years, he's going to just make life more miserable for everyone he happens to encounter. And then I said, and you can get away with murdering him and no one will ever know. You're a perfect opportunity to shove him off a cliff and no one's ever going to know you did it. Would that be wrong? Even, right? Because if you're saying, well, it's good for society, we don't want more of this, but in this one instance, would it still be intrinsically wrong for you to murder that guy in that setting?
And you're asking why I would say that would be wrong.
What would make that intrinsically wrong? That's really what I'm asking. Yeah.
I mean, in our legal system or societal system, we have due process, and he wouldn't be being afforded that.
Oh, he didn't do anything to get capital punishment either. I mean, he's an asshole. Nobody benefits from knowing him, but it's not like anybody would say he deserves death
Right.
in a
It's like
trial.
saying, oh, yeah, it's like saying if you could go back in time and kill baby Hitler, would you do it?
Okay,
That
no,
stupid
okay.
argument.
Again, Hitler deserved capital punishment. Perhaps I'm saying that this
Okay.
guy
Okay. So this guy's
doesn't
just an
add
asshole.
anything. Like you say, we're getting along and having a better life, and I succeed, you succeed. He's out of that game. Everybody who
Right.
encounters him is less likely to succeed for having encountered him, and he is
Right.
dead set on never succeeding himself. And he's just in a miserable, miserable place.
Mhm.
But I'm not saying he's going around killing babies or something, right?
Yep.
That's a different question. There's a difference between capital punishment and murder and all of that. I'm saying he's not like that. He's just an asshole, and he's likely to be an asshole for the next 10 years. The reason why I'm setting it up this way is to try to say, if the reason murder is wrong is that it would be generally better in society if people weren't going around murdering. I'm saying, well, yeah, that's true, but this is a specific case where you might say it could be better. Let's say he spits on people and punches them, but he never kills anybody. It's just he's just there's no positive social encounter that anybody has with this individual, my hypothetical individual. Would it still be wrong to murder him if you knew you could get away with it? Or if you knew for sure no one would ever find out, what would make it wrong?
You tell me.
Well, no, because it sounds like you're saying it's intrinsically wrong, that murder is intrinsically wrong. So I'm saying, well, then it can't be intrinsically wrong if the only reason it's wrong is for social consequences, right? Again, your argument wasn't bad. You
Right.
can say, look, here's some good evidence that it's wrong, is because it also has a lot of negative consequences for everything. Sure, that's fine, but that can't be the grounding for what makes it intrinsically wrong, because I can come up with a hypothetical where it wouldn't apply. So what's the universal thing that makes it really, really wrong? You've got all the reason in the world to think you can get away with it, and that the world is just basically a better place.
So you have okay, and you have to give a non-religious reason for why it's wrong.
You don't have to. You don't have to. You can give any reason you want. If we're just playing with ideas, right? I don't think what I'm saying. You don't have to think what you're saying. We're just trying to debate it out and see where it gets. So you can give any argument that you think is true.
Yeah. Okay. I would say, to me personally, I know in my heart it's wrong. I'm convicted that it's wrong, and my faith tells me that it's wrong. But as far as ethically why it's wrong, I don't know. I can't really give an answer.
That's interesting. I should have when I set up the hypothetical, I should have been clear. I don't think you would be tempted to murder him in the first place. Like, right.
I know.
I'm not trying to set up a hypothetical where you really want to kill this guy because you just can't wait to get away with a murder. But because I know it's wrong, I won't do it. No, you're saying intrinsically, I think, oh, that's revolting. I can't imagine somebody doing that. That's a horrible thing to do, right? So you're appealing to intuition there. And faith, which could be different.
But don't get me wrong. Everyone, I'm sure I might be slightly tempted, if there was the golden opportunity and say, okay, this guy's been nothing but screw me over and hurt everyone I care about, and nobody would know. That the temptation might be there.
Yeah, you can imagine a hypothetical where you were tempted, I suppose. But this is a guy, he hasn't done anything to you.
Okay.
You're just, you see that you could nudge him off a cliff. You know what kind of a person he is. It annoys you that he's such a pain in the butt to everybody and that he's making life worse. But it's not like, you have some desire to kill him or something. But okay.
Could the argument be made that if this individual is so despicable and you have the contempt, that killing them would be letting them off easy, and isolation would be the real
Ouch.
death sentence to them for the reputation that they've earned.
That's an interesting idea. Um, whether that's correct or not, we've divorced the question enough from the idea that it would be sufficient to say what are the consequences to society, right? Originally, we were saying, hey, it's bad for society if people are murdering, and now we're saying, well, that's not the foundation of what makes this bad. It happens to be the case, and that's good complementary evidence that it's bad, perhaps, but it's not the grounding for why it's bad, right? If you have to say, hey, it'd be better for him to suffer being who he is, it's like, okay, well, it's still the consequences for society might be improved if he just wasn't in the picture anymore. So,
Well, but he would be the person that you don't want to be. He is the example in society. Everybody who comes across him and they say, you see that man? You see who that man over there? That
you
is
don't want to go
exactly
that way.
who you don't want to be. That is the example of what you don't want to be like in society. And the reason he is alive is be the prime example of be the exact opposite of who this man is.
So now you've gotten back to that's really cool. Thank you for doing that, by the way, because I know that's not even your view of the basics of ethics or the basis of ethics. So that's fantastic. So now you've gotten back to the argument where he said, no, wait, we could ground this in what's good for society. What's good for society is to have the full panoply of consequences on display for us so that we know what world we're living in and where we might go. For who can tell to what red hell his sightless soul may stray? Well, let's let the person live their life out so that other people can say, oh, wow, there are really consequences to me becoming like that. And I might want to avoid it. Whereas if we took it away, then maybe 3 more people could fill in that vacuum because they never encountered that person and they might be tempted to go that way. But that does tie it right back into the social consequence thing again in an interesting way. So good job. That's an interesting thought. I think there's something true about that, even if it's not the ultimate grounding. And again, it's just to be clear to anyone who's listening, nobody in this hypothetical debate is actually advocating their own views necessarily. We're just trying to work them out.
Right.
Okay. Well, when we read tomorrow, we're going to see the author we've been reading bring up intuition as well. So Mark may have been onto something there that perhaps it's inescapable that intuition plays a role, or what the deontologist was saying, that a moral faculty, a conscience. I have eyes and so I can see things, and I have a conscience and so I feel accurately that this thing is wrong. Maybe my conscience can be wrong sometimes, just like my eyes can be, but maybe there's a faculty that of intuition that plays an inescapable role in this, according to this author, perhaps. The other idea that was floated as we were just sort of floating, I can't remember if it was Mark or who said it, was something akin to the discourse theory, where basically we talk it out until we all come to a consensus, because then we can get along. And then it might not even matter if murder is wrong or right. What matters is that we all agree, right? As long as we're all agreeing, we can work in unison. If everybody knows that it's everybody around you thinks it's good to murder if you can get away with it, well, then we'll be living in accordance with that knowledge, and that would be better as long as we're all on the same page. And so it's not that it's ultimately right or wrong. It's that, well, we're talking it out so that we can get all of our feelings aligned so we can herd in the same direction somehow. I know that nobody here is advocating that view, but it occurred to me that some of what was being said seemed to hint in that direction, where it's like, well, we talk it out and we come to realize that we all think basically the same thing on certain issues. If that's the grounding of ethics, then it's a language game. If that's the grounding of ethics, then it's a consensus game, right? It's a game to see, like, what makes it right or wrong is just how well we're all in agreement with each other, in a sense. In which case, if the Nazis took over the world, then their ideology would be good. You wouldn't want to be the one sowing discord by not going along with it, right? I know nobody advocates that, but so in any case, we can see that there's a lot that hopefully we're going to get to discover as we continue looking at these different perspectives. We'll finish the objectivist argument tomorrow, and we'll see how convincing he is. Here's a good question. Can we just take a poll of everybody in the room? Do you think ethics are objective? Right? We were talking about ways of grounding it as if it's a real thing. Do you think that the statement murder is wrong is a statement that's not just about psychology or my feelings or a political consensus? It's actually about something. Like, I can't point to murder. The concept of murder is a concept, right? The actions of murder, you could point to an action, but murder means all instances of that type of action. So to say murder is wrong, is it the type of statement that could be factually accurate apart from people voting or debating or emoting? I think we already know that Mark thinks it is. And we can change our views as we keep reading. I think probably Savad thinks it is. I imagine Alana thinks it is. Maybe it's too basic a question from our previous discussions. I guess I can guess your answers. Well, let's do this. In the future, we'll try to work on coming up with ways that we can ground that conviction that at least three of us have. And so that's what we're going to do. So let's end the stream and we'll chat some more.